In some ways, it would be foolish to call Solstice a breath of fresh air, as this is a game that borrows from the Devil May Cry playbook in some serious ways. Fixed camera angles, action sequences bookended by post-battle scorecards, and a progression and mission structure that feel more at home on the PS2 than a game for modern consoles. But this throwback action title does bring some interesting design choices with it that save the title from feeling wholly derivative, and in some ways, it carves out its own distinct identity. If you've been watching this channel, you've probably noticed that I gravitate towards some interesting games from time to time. Between the mess that was Grey Hill Incident, and what might be the worst written game of all time in Rachel Foster, and then the so bad it's good disaster piece of Wanted Dead, it should be clear that I am not always interested in covering the games with the biggest budgets and highest Metacritic scores. Even if my last video was on Final Fantasy XVI, but that's kind of besides the point. Instead, I am usually pulled into the B-game zone, as I feel that is where games are free to make strange choices and get experimental. And that's what brought me to Reply Game Studios' 2022 release of Soulstice, a game that I just somehow missed upon its initial release. But given the fact that Reply Games is an Italian studio with only 30 core members, that up until Soulstice had only released a VR game called Theseus and an iOS game with the super strange title of Joe Denver's Lone Wolf, maybe it isn't that surprising that Reply Games and their latest work flew under my radar. But after one of my friends recommended the title to me, and having access to it through its addition to the PlayStation Plus Premium library, I decided to justify my subscription by checking out this game. So, what is Soulstice? At its core, this is a hack and slash game with some novel mechanics, a distinct art style, and rad music set in a grimdark interpretation of a gothic fantasy world. And right away, its influences should be obvious. Ogival architecture, our main character wielding a giant sword, demons that talk shit, and more than its fair share of fixed camera angles, it should be clear that Soulstice is influenced by the early Devil May Cry entries, Dark Souls in some key ways, and in no small part, Kentaro Miura's magnum opus, Berserk. Its combat is stylish and fast-paced with all sorts of nuance. It features larger-than-life boss fights, tons of secrets and platforming in its exploration sections, and a plot that revolves around a world-ending calamity, tons of betrayal, and a whole lot of dark imagery and themes. And all of this is handled in a way that feels decidedly old school. In a lot of ways, this game is a throwback to both PS2 and early PS3 character action games, and this title does not try to hide that this is the case. Through interviews and even their own About section on the Reply Games website, the studio has shared their aspirations of becoming a AA development studio, with hopes of becoming the Italian equivalent of Platinum Games in particular, both in developing a signature style for their action games, but also by doing collaborations in the future as Platinum Games has done with their titles like the delisted Legend of Korra, Transformers Devastation, and most importantly, Nier Automata. And with Soulstice, Reply has thrown its hat in the ring with hopes of making something comparable to the games directed by Platinum Games' co-founder Hideki Kamiya, director of games like Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, Okami, and Bayonetta. So with such high hopes and such a clear mission, how did writer/director Fabio Paghetti and the rest of the team at Reply do in realizing such lofty ambitions? And the answer is pretty damn well for the most part. But in some other ways, the studio shows some weird growing pains that come from trying to emulate a style of game that has evolved further than Reply was willing to push it, and some weird writing choices that feel a little outdated and overly edgy at times. As far as developing a stylish action game, Reply definitely succeeded with its presentation, and in a lot of ways Solstice front-loads some of its coolest design choices, with the game introducing our pair of main characters, Briar and Lute, mid-combat. This cold open flexes this game's art style from the jump. Surrealist landscapes tied together with gothic imagery, but also leaning into its unique character design. We get a small peek of our main character mid-transformation, something that I will expand upon later in this video, but we are also introduced to this awesome Ben 10 meets Berserk design philosophy when it comes to our main characters. It is an art style that is equal parts cartoonish and anime influenced, and while I could imagine that some will find this direction off-putting, I immediately locked into this style and appreciated how it gave this title its own distinct visual identity. But the game continues to forge its identity with its morphing weapon design and, most importantly, its soundtrack. choirs and strings juxtaposed against frantic EDM synth stings and dirty breakbeats. I am not exaggerating when I say that certain songs from this soundtrack instantly became some of my favorites in all of video game music altogether. And seriously, instead of just talking about it, I'll just let you sample some of this score for yourselves. Seriously, the team behind the soundtrack, Francesco Liberon and Lorenzo Scagnaroli, put together a soundscape that amplifies every single scene, no matter how slow and brooding or high intensity and cathartic. And in some ways, I think Solstice is worth the price of admission just to hear and see this OST in context. But just as this prologue is introducing the player to the red line of what this game has to offer, the story flashes back to one day prior and sets us off on our adventure proper. And it is here that we get a feel for what this game is going to be like for the majority of its runtime. After some exposition and proper introduction to our playable pair of sisters, Briar, who we soon learn is an Ashen Knight, more on that later, and Lute, who is a Spectre, or in this game, Shade, with the two of them coming together to form an entity known as a Chimera. Basically, two souls that inhabit one body bound together by some arcane magic and an intense bond between the two souls. Briar has been tasked with investigating and hopefully stopping a calamity known as a tear from destroying not only one of her world's capital cities, but also the entire world at large, should the chaos spilling from beyond the veil go unchecked. And although we've already been introduced to this game in a more bombastic style, there is a more somber and melancholic vibe that permeates this opening mission and the majority of the game proper. It's definitely dark fantasy in its tone and use of language, but as the story takes shape, it becomes more and more about these two sisters, their bond, and how they've been manipulated by the powers that be. And between some choices like having Lute take shape around Briar's shoulders whenever she comes to a standstill, and having an otherworldly quality to all of the voice lines in this game, there is a strange gravity to every conversation between this tragic pair. And it should be noted that not only Briar, but also Lute are both voiced by Stephanie Justin, of not just Metal Gear Solid fame, but this is the second time that she has been part of a B-tier action game after voicing Wanted Dead's Gunsmith earlier this year. I mean, technically she did Solstice first, but who's counting? And really, I find it interesting that with Justin lending both her voice and likeness to Metal Gear Solid 5 and Wanted Dead, I think that it is here in Solstice, with the actress taking on a more traditional voice acting role, that we get a feel for just how talented she can be.
We did it, sister.
It looks like we did. Good.
With Stephanie voicing both of these characters simultaneously, she definitely shows far more range than she has been able to with either of those past performances. And in this early mission, the conversations between the two establish a dark and moody atmosphere. These two girls are not here by choice, and really it was a series of tragedies that brought them to this place. Tragedies that they are all too aware of, but also horrors that they have yet to learn. And the imagery of the environment, the droning soundtrack, and an overall mood that denotes a calm before the storm, these things elevate the atmosphere to an impressive level. But if there is one technique or piece of art direction that really lends itself to establishing the overall mood of this game, it is the tried and true method of utilizing fixed camera angles. With the camera pulled back and the foreground completely dominated by the city and the tear in the background, Reply establishes both scale and keeps the end goal of this game in sight in a way that calls games like Half-Life 2 and Journey to mind. And in these establishing shots, Solstice's classical architecture is played against surrealist backdrops that feel like concept art come to life. It is cinematic as hell, establishes a great sense of scale, and really pulled me into these early parts of the experience. So, with Reply's focus on making a stylish action game, I think it's safe to say that they've nailed the stylish part. But how does the game actually play? Because no matter how pretty or cool this game can look and sound, it really doesn't matter if it can't compete with the games that it is emulating on the action level. Like Devil May Cry, and by that, I don't mean the series at large, and instead I'm honing in on the PS2 entries, Solstice is an area-focused hack-and-slash game that also mixes up its slower moments with exploration and puzzle sequences that are presented with fixed camera angles. And these scenes are as pretty as you remember them from the PS2 era, but they also come with the same bullshit platforming and action-obscuring camera fuckery that made them fall out of favor in the first place. You hack your way through enemies, unlock new weapons through progression, collect red orbs from enemies, discarded furniture in the environment, and even giant crystals that have you wail on them for a while before they break. On a surface level, Briar does not veer too far away from what was established in Dante's outings. And in the early game, it's fair to say that Solstice feels somewhat undercooked when compared to Capcom's character action mascot. Briar has 2 weapons at her disposal, well, 1 really, since it's a transforming weapon, but in the beginning she effectively has a sword and a sledgehammer. Attack strings are limited to standard 4-hit combos, with the only nuance seemingly anchored to which weapon you want to hit your enemies with. You can slash 4 times, or you can bludgeon 4 times, with some extra style points coming from whether or not you switch weapon forms mid-combo. Briar has a pretty solid dash for evading and closing distance, but spamming this more than twice in a row leads to a recovery animation, so you quickly learn to choose your moments. And then finally, Briar's kit is filled out by Loot's ability to counter at a distance. Whenever an enemy is getting ready to hit you, a prompt will appear above their head in order for Loot to intercept the attack. And this takes a little getting used to. When I first saw this prompt, I originally thought that it was going to function in the way that Rocksteady popularized back in Arkham Asylum. But instead, things are a bit more manual here. Upon hitting this prompt, Loot essentially freezes the enemy in place mid-swing, allowing Briar to either back off or reposition herself out of the way of the oncoming attack. And all of this works, but the early missions feel a little clunky. Animations are cancelable, and there is definitely a skill ceiling established here, but there is a certain stiffness in the way that combat and animations operate. There is probably a better way of explaining this, but I've been having a bit of trouble articulating it, so instead, I'll put it this way. When you play a game like Street Fighter, you have animations and cancel windows that lend themselves to a very fluid experience. Moves have fast startup animations and cancel seamlessly into special moves, and you always feel in direct control of what is happening on the screen. But then there is the alternative approach found in the Mortal Kombat series. Moves have slower startups and more lumbering animations, but where Street Fighter mostly relies on carefully canceling into your special moves or waiting for recovery frames in order to link a follow-up attack, Mortal Kombat has a stiffer and less responsive system where you instead dial your combos as soon as the first hit connects. And this makes attack strings more reliable and easier to do, but you do lose some of that fluidity. And by the way, I'm hardly making a judgment here, as I think both franchises have their strengths and weaknesses, but there is a certain heft and lack thereof with both of these approaches. Solstice feels more like Mortal Kombat in the way that it handles its attack strings. Animations stick around for a little longer than I had anticipated, and there is a slight clunkiness to the way that Briar handles, at least in the early game. As you progress through the story, you unlock new weapons, purchase new abilities for your loadout, and these add layers of depth rather quickly. Stinger-style advancing attacks, launchers, helm breakers, and charge attacks get added to the kit. And while these are appreciated, they are hardly where Solstice carves out its own niche in the character action genre. Instead, Solstice relies on a few interesting systems to set itself apart. First, there's Loot. As you progress and collect a secondary currency for her abilities, Loot learns auto attacks, buffs that lower cooldowns and help with crowd control, and even synergy attacks that allow for powerful finishing moves. But she also offers a more novel solution in the form of fields. After progressing a bit into the game, Loot learns to manipulate the surrounding area through the use of evocation and banishment magic. On the practical side, these spells create zones where Loot can exploit the weakness of specific enemy types. These fields are blue and red respectively, and so your kit goes from being a standard character action game to an exercise in pattern recognition and efficiency. Enemies are either neutral and can be attacked without the aid of either field, wraiths are coded to the evocation field, and possessed enemies are only vulnerable while under the influence of banishment. And this may sound vaguely familiar. A character action game made by a European studio with aspirations of becoming one of the best in the genre, a slick art style, a little less refined combat than its contemporaries, and now red and blue coded enemies that require the player to take action to fight them off. And I get it. Ninja Theory's DMC definitely added this layer to the formula back in 2013. Ninja Theory undoubtedly threw this Ikaruga influence into the genre first, with Nier Automata implementing the bullet hell aspect of it just a few years later. But here in Solstice, there is an extra layer of strategy that comes with meter management and crowd control. Loot can only keep these fields up for a limited amount of time, and although there are upgrades later in the game that make keeping these zones around a lot easier, combat feels like a dance of identifying threats and then reacting to them within a time limit. And when the game throws mixed groups at you, there is an extra wrinkle. The wraiths, or the blue enemies, when they are outside of the field, they are difficult to see, and just because you may not be able to see them or damage them directly when they're not under the influence of these fields, it does not mean that they stop being a threat. And just as a little side note, with color-coded enemies factoring so deeply into combat and the game utilizing color in so many interesting ways in its design, being able to actually see these colors matters more than in other games. And for someone like me, someone who's colorblind, accessibility features present in this game not only took care of this problem, but also helped in me being able to finally diagnose exactly what type of color blindness I actually have, as the previews for each filter really clued me into what was going on. It turns out that I have deuteranopia, which is a type of red-green color blindness, and while it doesn't necessarily detract from my ability to enjoy video games too terribly, these filters were greatly appreciated. And thanks to Reply, I now have more insight to what has been going on with me. I just wanted to give a little shout out to that feature, and now that that's out of the way, on to the rest of the video. It's kind of hard to talk about this game without going on tangent after tangent, as each new layer that is added to the combat comes with primary and secondary consequences, and some of them feed into the exploration of this game as well. For instance, the fields, other than allowing for you to attack coded enemies, they are required for certain environmental elements. Red and blue crystals and walls can only be tackled by switching over to the correct field, but platforming on blue platforms requires switching over as well, with some tricky sections, sometimes just because of the game's fixed camera, requiring for you to drop the field mid-jump, as you may want to pass through a platform first before making them solid below you for a landing. And later on in Briar's quest, we are introduced to hazards such as floating blue mines that require its corresponding field to stop them from exploding, and then the opposite is true for explosive red mines, as they only charge when your field is active. But Solstice goes one step further in some of these enemy encounters by throwing these hazards into the arenas while you are fighting color-coded enemies as well. So you find yourself in this chaotic mess where you are mid-combo string against a possessed enemy, all while a mine beneath you is charging up. So on top of parrying, closing distance, fighting to keep the camera in a useful position, trying to keep your combo count up, and switching between fields and enemy patterns, you now have to choose whether or not you're going to back off and give up the advantage by dropping the field and letting the mine cool down, or if you are going to dash away or leap from the hazard. And aggression really is key in this game, as your combo count and its corresponding gauge play into this combat in some crucial ways. When you are light on your feet and able to keep the battle going without taking hits, your unity gauge charges. This is similar to DMC's style gauge, but this is even more important than just for determining your end of level rank, as unity allows for finishing attacks and Solstice's devil trigger equivalent known as the rapture state. Chimeras such as Loot and Briar are souls that have pierced the veil, neither truly alive or dead. And this leaves them susceptible to corruption, and corruption manifests here in 3 different ways with specific gameplay implications. The transformation we got a flash of at the beginning of this game with Briar's face looking like Melina without the mask in MK11 is her rapture state. In combat, when Briar's unity gauge reaches a certain threshold, she can transform into this super stylized version of herself and lay enemies to waste for a short amount of time. It's a pretty standard Devil Trigger analog, including transformation, very similar to what you see from the cast in Devil May Cry, and even Clive's limit break state from this year's Final Fantasy XVI. And as the game progresses, Briar is tested to the point where she loses some of the battle against her corruption, and it causes for her to transform into her second state, known as the Berserk form. And from an art direction standpoint, this form is rad, with purple and black dominating her color palette and transforming her into something far more primal than human in the way that she animates. I did get some slight flashbacks to Kaine's Shade form from Nier Replicant, but that might just be a me thing. When Briar is in this form, you do not control her, at least not in the traditional sense. She darts around the screen automatically killing enemies, and you essentially control Loot as she tries to reel her sister back to reality. And you do this by matching on-screen prompts, and failing to do so will result in a game over. This form is interesting as it adds a push-pull dynamic to combat in the way that it is implemented. Like the Rapture state, Berserk also procs once you have reached a specific unity threshold, but this version instead triggers when Briar is at low health. In theory, this is a rad concept, as it means that players who find themselves on their back foot can throw a Hail Mary whenever they are close to death and essentially risk a game over for a big swing in momentum. But I say this is a cool concept in theory because in practice, this is not how the system worked for me. I originally played this game on the normal difficulty, and while I have been chipping away at the tougher difficulties, during my initial playthrough, I only triggered this berserk form twice. Once when it was tied to the story, and the other when I chose to intentionally take damage before using an item that maxed out my unity gauge. The problem with this design is that it presupposes that you will be able to play pretty much perfectly after taking the necessary amount of damage. Getting your unity gauge up to the required level isn't always easy, and every time you take damage, the gauge takes a huge hit. So as a comeback mechanic, it doesn't necessarily work the way that it was intended, because if you are taking enough damage to where you would need the form, your gauge has probably already been depleted. I never found the game to be overly difficult, again, on the normal difficulty, even though there were certain arenas that piled on all the mechanics in such a way that took some getting used to. But battles for me basically worked in one of two ways. I either played well and was able to build unity pretty quickly while maintaining my health bar, or I would play just well enough to stay alive, but I would be getting hit in such a way that my unity gauge never built up, basically making it so that I could never trigger the berserk form. I did talk to my friend who recommended this game to me, and he told me that he was able to trigger the form pretty often. So this could just be a me thing, but in reality, I think it just points to him being a little bit more clutch than I am, or maybe I just took far less damage than he did on average. And who knows? There is a third transformation form, but I will get to that one in a little bit. And for the final mechanic, and to me this is the most important one, there is weapon proficiency. Every weapon in this game, outside of your default sword, of which there are eventually 6, has an enemy type or types that it is strong against. And while this does sound like it would just be a basic thing, like your bow is stronger against flying types, it goes a bit further than that as it directly impacts how quickly your unity gauge charges. But there is a caveat to this, however. Weapon proficiency is not only learned in the mid-level shop by collecting red orbs in the environment or at the stage clear screen, but these weapon proficiencies are only viewable in the shop menu as well. And these descriptions can be a little vague. It might be obvious when a weapon says that it's good against flying types or armored types, but when typings like resilient, ferocious, or swarmer get thrown around, it is not immediately clear what enemies the game is talking about. As you fight enemies and they are added to the bestiary, this screen outlines their typing, but when you are in the middle of a fight, things can get a little wonky at first. I would often find myself fighting an enemy and then having to pause the game and go into the bestiary to identify it, but then I would struggle to remember what weapon was strong against the enemy type I was fighting altogether, because there was no easy way to reference the weapon proficiency screen as it was only viewable in the shop, and because of this, I would often find myself having to give in to rote memorization. And I'm having trouble remembering whether or not this is the case, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I do know that the bestiary entries are updated after certain amounts of enemies are killed, and at this point I am struggling to remember whether or not the weaknesses are added up front or if they are gated behind killing enemies. And then there's another thing that is detrimental to the system. Weapons are only unlocked by progressing through the game. So you may not have the best weapon for an enemy type until you've made some progress in the story. And with a sword and hammer as your starting weapons, none of the enemies in these early chapters are weak to them. So it really takes some progression until you can make the most of your arsenal. And that is probably my biggest complaint surrounding Solstice. This game locks so many things behind story progression and currency unlocks, to the point where it takes about 2 complete playthroughs to have access to everything. And to make matters worse, this game is considerably more enjoyable once you have access to your full kit and all of its upgrades. At its core, Solstice is a game about assessing situations and then using the best options available to you to address the threat. And for hours at a time, you just don't have access to your best options. But once you do, the game becomes this cathartic celebration of strategy and execution. It's just not paced the best way initially, but subsequent playthroughs are a fucking joy to play. As a quick aside, Final Fantasy XVI was the last game that I played before diving into Solstice, and with Ryota Suzuki of Devil May Cry fame working on that title as the battle director, there was a certain amount of polish to Final Fantasy XVI that few character action games ever have. Animations were clean, dodging and parrying felt tight and responsive, and everything just sort of flowed. With my Mortal Kombat vs. Street Fighter analogy from earlier, Final Fantasy XVI and Devil May Cry definitely play more like Street Fighter than Mortal Kombat, which shouldn't be surprising as Devil May Cry is a Capcom property after all, and Final Fantasy XVI essentially uses Devil May Cry as a blueprint. But no matter how good it felt to control Clive, and it did feel awesome, I often found myself kind of checked out during combat, and even more so as the game went on. There was never any pressure to perform. There was no rating system during the main game, and yes, I know that there are modes where that kind of thing comes into play, but there was never any incentives such as extra experience or bonus items to reward the player for taking the game's systems to their limits. And then there was a duality to how combat was handled altogether, as smaller enemies felt like Devil May Cry fights, with you being able to string together air juggles and finishing moves, but all of the enemies of any real consequence required a playstyle that felt decidedly more like Final Fantasy VII Remake than Dante's outings. With the big boys, the playstyle is always the same. Dodge, parry, use your abilities to shatter the enemy's stagger gauge, and then dump all of your remaining abilities on them to cash out the damage. You couldn't flex on them with air combat, strategy basically went out the window as there were no enemy weaknesses to speak of or interesting builds, and fights played out pretty much the same throughout the game. Sure, new icons and abilities were added to the roster and your order of operations could change, but you were never identifying a threat and acting accordingly. You were just changing up your dodge timings and then fighting the same as you always did. And in that regard, I think that Solstice really is a breath of fresh air when compared to recent entries in the character action genre. It is a game where mechanics are constantly being added, new wrinkles are always showing up to give nuance to the battles, and you always feel like this game is evolving with you as you sink in the hours. And although Solstice can pile on the features in a way that can feel overwhelming in the beginning, once you lock in with them, there is a level of depth here that kept me hooked. Solstice is a good game on the first playthrough, and it is an excellent one if you're willing to play with it after the credits roll. But so far, I have really only talked about this game from a presentation and mechanics perspective, and those things definitely are the highlights. And it is at this point that I'm going to issue a spoiler warning as I discuss some of the plot details. You can jump ahead to the timestamp above if you don't want any of the particulars spelled out for you, but by this point, you should probably know whether or not this game interests you. And if it does, I'd encourage you to leave the video now, and maybe come back afterwards. But if you are on your way out, please consider dropping a like, sub, or comment on your way, as it does help out this channel immensely. Solstice's story is pretty solid. It's not going to win any awards, but it does give the player more than just an excuse to press on with the combat. I had mentioned before that Briar and Lute were a chimera and that their souls had been bound together, but the pair was not always that way. Instead, they were just normal human sisters until Briar and her parents were attacked by a corrupted. This corrupted Briar as well, leading to a chain of events that left Lute fatally wounded by her possessed sister. But as they were dying, the Grand Master of the Order, an organization that is supposed to be the last line of defense from the terrors and all of the monsters that spill from it, recognized the bond between the two sisters as they were able to fight off the corruption for a time and still show concern for one another no matter how bad their circumstance was. And then the Grand Master decided to bind their souls to one another to form a chimera, and then conscript them into becoming Knights of the Ashen Blade, essentially an organization that serves as the Order's sword. During the events of Solstice, the sisters have very little recollection of their lives before. Bits and pieces, sure, but what little there is obscured through trauma and by the very nature of their new condition. At its beginning, Solstice is a get to the tower and stop the end of the world kind of story. But as it peels away, it is more about these two sisters coming to understand the nature of the terrors, who is responsible for them, and then unraveling the circumstances that brought them to their current state. But in addition to these themes, it is also a game about the sisters struggling to maintain their humanity as the world threatens to turn them into monsters. And as the story unfolds, there are events that cause Briar to give up some of her humanity in exchange for power in the form of transformations. And Briar is forced to embrace both her Rapture and Berserk forms, and ultimately what we are told is a fate worse than death for a chimera in Transcendence. When a chimera can no longer hold on to their humanity, they transform into something truly monstrous. And while Briar and Lute were sent to investigate and stop this terror, they were far from the only chimera that had been sent to this doomed city. Early on, we meet Donovan, who really beats you over the head with the Berserk influence as, this is just guts. But he is a chimera known as the Shadeless, because he refuses to summon the soul that he is bound to in combat. He is a mentor character of sorts, and he cryptically encourages us on our mission. But then there are the other two chimera who have transcended before we ever get to meet them. And these monsters are amazing. two souls twisted into one another in a macabre way, these boss fights rival even the Dark Souls bosses in terms of raw creativity. And with two distinct personalities struggling to command their new form, there is all sorts of room for dark characterization and brutality. This is the fate that awaits our protagonists if they are unable to hold on to their humanity as well. But it is that threat that makes these sisters the chosen ones in this story, as their connection to each other makes it so that they are unable to forget who they were entirely. Even when the corruption threatens to take over Briar's physical form, Lute plunges into Briar's mind in order to stop her from turning completely. It is here that we fully understand the tragedy that befell the pair, and although it is always presented in this ethereal manner, these sequences really change their understanding of what it is that they were subjected to. But it is also here where the storytelling gets a little too edgy for its own good. Each one of these sequences plays out a piece of Briar's memories, but they are always bookended with what seems to be Briar's reality between becoming corrupted and then being turned into an Ashen Knight, and they can be a bit gratuitous. Each of these sequences uses an obscure wire mesh aesthetic throughout, but each of them ends with a full render of a nude Briar who has been chained by the limbs and neck. The first time you see this, it is shocking in a heavy metal kind of way, but it is kind of cool from an aesthetic standpoint. But time and time again, this scene plays out and the camera just lingers just a little too long on Briar's naked form, complete with nipples, to be tasteful. Each one of these chapters sexualizes the character in a BDSM kind of way, and it just seems kind of out of place. Other than her relationship with Lute, Briar is really just an avatar, as the only characterization here is the fact that a tragedy befell her, she got turned into a weapon, and now she needs to figure out how to stop the tear. And sexuality doesn't really play into her characterization at all outside of these weird moments. There is no real reason for this fetishization in terms of how it impacts the overall plot. And it's not just with her, as Armina is overly sexualized even in her monstrous form, as her chimera partner, who appears to be a psychopath who hates her, is twisted into her form and nestled firmly between her comically large monster titties. And what bothers me about this sequence is that, from a monster design perspective, this is some insanely competent art. These monsters are visually arresting and imaginative, but I have trouble understanding how they feed into the overall themes and characterization. And by including some fetishistic motifs such as choking and bondage, as well as just an overall cruelty towards some of the female characters, it just kind of felt gross at these moments. And then the camera pans, I couldn't tell if this was fan service directed towards a supposedly horny edgelord demographic, or just an overly bricked up director. And given the fact that modders have already put out a nude mod for Briar's character model, the jury's out on that one. A few videos ago, I covered the suicide of Rachel Foster from 101 Games on this channel, 101 being another Italian studio, and I critiqued how that game made some really problematic choices when it came to depicting the sexualization and grooming of a minor by a middle-aged man. And while I don't find this game as offensive, at least I don't think I do, but Briar's age is never overtly stated, I am now in this weird place where two games that I've selected seemingly at random from Italian studios have had some pretty strange ways of treating their female characters. And while I know that two games can hardly count as a pattern, it's just a weird coincidence, and I don't know, I feel like I'm gonna have my eye out for this kind of shit whenever I'm playing Italian games from now on. But even with that said, I really like Soulstice. Edginess and all. More than anything, it reminded me of the type of game that I flocked to when I was younger. Games like Devil May Cry, The Darkness, and even Drakengard. A game that is rock solid from a design standpoint, and is worth more than its weight in gold in terms of artistry. And even the edgier parts would have fired off for me if I was still maladjusted and confined to a bedroom for most of the hours of the day. In a lot of ways, Soulstice reminds me that it's okay to be punk. And similar to how punk music as a movement is mostly dead and gone, there has always been and always will be a new generation ready to build upon what has been done in the past. A new group of kids that keep the spirit of rebellion and crass attitudes alive, all while making a glorious fucking racket in the process. Solstice has taken what has inspired it and ran with it while carving out an identity that is all its own. And it really shows that, in a metaphorical sense, the kids are alright. There is still a desire and a demand for this style of game, even if its roots go 20 years back. And even though it sometimes feels like it's just playing the hits, and some of the problems that have always been there are still present and accounted for, there is definitely substance to be found if you are willing to take a look. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching, as it is always greatly appreciated. And if you liked the video, please consider dropping a like, commenting, or subscribing. Solstice was the type of game that I really just fell in love with. Sure, it's been done before, but it felt cozy and familiar, and the novel parts to it really stood out, with an art direction that was just amazing and a soundtrack that, it hits, man. But that's going to be the end of this video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. And until then, you're all beautiful people, and I hope you have a nice day.